Patrick Henry's father came to the colonies from Scotland, where he'd been educated at King's College in Aberdeen. He married the widow Sarah Winston Sim of Hanover County, Virginia, where their son Patrick was born on Studley Plantation in 1736. Named after his father's brother, the local Anglican minister, Patrick grew up in a household divided by religious conflict. His father continued to serve on the Anglican vestry, while his mother often took the children to the church of the Reverend Samuel Davies, a fervent Presbyterian dissenter whose evangelical style may have inspired Patrick's flair for oratory. It is said he would recite Davies' sermons from memory during the carriage ride home. With help from his father, Patrick and his half-brother opened a small store in Hanover. Although he kept meticulous records, the enterprise did not prosper, perhaps because he loved storytelling and hunting as much as any young lad of his time.
Obvious this horse has no belly. Will not make it past the grain bin, much less around the track.
These 2 shillings will prove you misspoken, sir.
I'll cover your 2 shillings, sir.
Very well, then. Let the horses run, then.
We'll do that this afternoon.
Patrick fell in love with Sarah Shelton, whose father owned Hanover Tavern. They presented themselves to their parents for permission to marry when he was 18 and she 16, young by the standards of the day. But with both families' reluctant approval, they were wed in October 1754 at the Shelton home, Rural Plains.
Take Sarah to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold, for richer, for poorer.
On the farm given to them by her father, Patrick tried his hand at raising tobacco, but during these years the crop was poor throughout Virginia. After a few seasons of meager yields, a fire destroyed the young family's home. They moved to Hanover, where Patrick helped his father-in-law run the tavern. From the courthouse across the road came lawyers, litigants, and stories of their cases.
Prosecute a Virginia farmer for taxes owing to some British minister.
Aye, then. Virginia's laws should be made by Virginians.
Patrick took an interest and began to read law books. It is said that after only a few months of study, he passed his bar examination in Williamsburg, under the scrutiny of George Wythe and John Randolph, who declared,
Mr. Henry, if your industry be half the equal of your genius, then I know you will be an ornament and an honor to your profession.
Thank you, sir.
Patrick found himself well suited to this new calling. Traveling widely among the Virginia courts, he soon developed a reputation as a hard-working country lawyer, handling nearly 1,200 cases in the first 3 years of his practice. Although his rates were modest, he was finally able to provide successfully for his growing family. When he was 27, a case came to him that changed his life dramatically. Although Patrick's religious faith was profound, circumstances called for him to speak against the Anglican clergy. At the time, ministers were paid by their parishes in tobacco. The rate was fixed by law at £16,000 per year, regardless of the market price. But several bad years and a drought had reduced the crop so severely that the market price went sky high. The prospect of their planters going suddenly bankrupt moved the Virginia House of Burgesses to pass a law fixing ministers' salaries at 2 pence per pound of tobacco, regardless of the market value. The parsons appealed to King George, who declared the Virginia law null and void. Supported by the king's ruling, the parsons sued for their back salaries at the inflated price. And in Hanover, where Patrick Henry's father was the presiding judge and his uncle an Anglican minister, they won.
Gentlemen,
the case first came to Patrick Henry in the final session, where
before you. It remains only for the jury to fix the amount of back wages which are to be paid. I know you will do justice.
To make what case he could on behalf of the people, even against the interests of his uncle and father, Patrick Henry spoke. At first, he was so awkward and hesitant that his father slumped in embarrassment, and the clergy smiled amongst themselves.
Weight
But Patrick continued, and as he began to find himself, a death-like silence fell over the courtroom.
More than what the price of
His
tobacco
natural
may be
gift
from
was
one
revealed
year
for the
to
first
next.
time.
The continuing disregard of the pressing wants of this colony constitutes an instance of royal misrule.
He asserted as a fundamental premise that government exists only by the consent of the governed. Therefore, a king who annuls a just law becomes a tyrant. He denounced the Parsons strategy of seeking their back pay during a time of hardship for the people.
The naked? Oh, no, gentlemen. Instead of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, these rapacious harpies would, were their powers equal to their will, snatch from the hearth of their honest parishioner his last hoe cake, from the widow and her orphan children their last milk cow.
His argument was so moving and his words so eloquent that tears were seen on his father's face, and the dismayed clergy filed out of the courtroom. In a stunning gesture of defiance, he finished by asking that the jury award
more than 1 farthing. 1 farthing will satisfy all the defense desires.
Through an atmosphere charged with tension, the jury, which included some religious dissenters, filed out. In less than 5 minutes, they returned and announced their verdict.
We find for the plaintiff damages in the amount of 1 penny.
A joyous throng rushed to hoist Patrick to their shoulders and parade him around the court square. Celebrations lasted into the night. In one electrifying moment, this young country lawyer had become a popular hero and the voice of the people in the movement that would eventually become the American Revolution. The depth of the feelings Patrick Henry had sounded within his countrymen soon became apparent. Suddenly famous, he found himself in Williamsburg in a new role as a delegate to the House of Burgesses. In February 1765, the British Parliament passed the hated Stamp Act, a tax mandating the purchase of British revenue stamps for almost all colonial business transactions. Working at night, alone, Patrick drafted 7 resolutions on a blank page of an old law book. The young delegate had been in the House only 9 days when, on his 29th birthday, he rocked that dignified body to its foundations by presenting the Virginia Resolutions, which asserted that the Stamp Act violated Virginians' right to self-government and thus evoked their duty to resist. There followed a most bloody debate, said Thomas Jefferson, watching from the doorway. The debate climaxed by a towering speech from Henry that Jefferson called a splendid display. He spoke, as Homer wrote, with torrents of sublime eloquence. As tradition recounts it, Patrick concluded with,
Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III, treason, may profit from their example. If this be treason, make the most of it.
After the consternation and debate that followed, a count was taken. Patrick Henry's Virginia resolutions were carried. The controversial 5th resolution, which asserted that only Virginia's elected assembly could tax Virginians, passed by a single vote.
Aye.
Copies were promptly printed and circulated among the colonies. The name Patrick Henry had suddenly become known throughout the continent. The people's spirits took fire, John Adams said, and burst forth in a blaze. The Stamp Act was repealed by Parliament on March 16, 1766.
The question before the House is
Returned to the House of Burgesses in 1767, Patrick spoke against the Townshend Acts, a new attempt by Britain to tax American overseas commerce. Resentment grew stronger in all the colonies. When Governor Botetourt officially dissolved the House, Henry was principal among the delegates who met in the Raleigh Tavern to continue their session. Long a proponent of economic self-sufficiency, he strongly supported George Washington's proposal that the colonies boycott British goods until the Townsend duties were repealed. A non-importation resolve was drawn up and signed by the unofficial delegates, and the market for British goods began to suffer throughout the colonies. The small Henry family had grown to a large one by this time, but his beloved Sarah's health had begun to decline after the birth of their sixth child. Patrick purchased a Hanover County plantation with more gracious accommodations and took up residence there. His restless eye for a good piece of land at a good price would lead the ever-increasing family to 12 different homes during his lifetime. During the late 1760s, a wave of unrest accompanied the Baptist movement as it spread through the colonies. Appealing to the common folk and even slaves, Baptist evangelists were sometimes brutally persecuted and often jailed for disturbing the peace.
Did I hear it distinctly, or was it a mistake of my own? Did I hear an expression as of a crime that these gentlemen whom your worships are about to try for misdemeanor are charged with what? Preaching the gospel of the Son of God? Great God. Great God! Preaching the gospel of the Son of God. Great God!
As the prosecution could find no sufficient response, the case was dismissed. The tolerance for religious dissent that Henry had acquired in his upbringing was to bring him friends among many religious groups.
And will affect the lives of our children as well.
As the colonists struggled to assert their freedom, the specter of slavery continued to shadow their definition of individual rights. A Hanover Quaker named Robert Pleasance set an example in 1772 by freeing his slaves and hiring them at laborers' wages. In a letter to Pleasance, Henry struggled with the paradox that
Christianity, whose chief excellence consists in softening the human heart, should encourage a practice so totally repugnant to the first impression of right and wrong. What adds to the wonder is that this abominable practice has been introduced in the most enlightened ages, in a country above all others fond of liberty. Would anyone believe that I am master of slaves of my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living without them. I will not, I cannot justify it. I believe a time will come when an opportunity will come to abolish this lamentable evil. If we cannot reduce this wish for reformation to practice, let us treat the unhappy victims with lenity. It is the furthest advance we can make towards justice. I know not where to stop. I could say many things on this subject, a serious review of which gives a gloomy perspective to future times.
by the next year, unrest had turned to action in Boston. Patriots disguised as Indians boarded English ships and poured more than 300 chests of taxed British tea into Boston Harbor. When the British Parliament responded by ordering the port of Boston closed, Henry, the Lee brothers, Mason, Jefferson, and others met secretly and organized a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer on behalf of the besieged Bostonians. It was a brilliant maneuver that succeeded in bypassing the Virginia moderates' objections to public protest. Henry led Virginia's delegates at the First Continental Congress, convened in Philadelphia in 1774. He summarized the strong movement among the liberals for unification.
The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American.
As public affairs began to turn ominous, Patrick's personal life was beset by a series of blows. His father died, and he was obliged to help settle his financial affairs. Sarah, after a long period of decline, began to behave irrationally and had to be confined. During the last years of her life, even though it was the custom of the time that the servants should care for her, Patriot brought Sarah food and comfort whenever he could. His devotion to her remained steadfast to the end, even though it is said that she died without recognizing him. He never spoke of her again. In a letter, he said, the remembrances were too painful. In deepening political crisis, the Virginia Burgesses assembled in Richmond at the largest building available, what is now St. John's Church.
The gentleman from Fairfax.
Mr. President, I am a soldier and believe in being prepared. For that and other reasons, I will give my vote for the resolutions of the gentleman from Hanover. Rather than submit to the present condition of things, I will raise 1,000 men, subsist them at my own expense, and march myself at their head to the relief of Boston.
The gentleman from Hanover.
Mr. President, it is natural for a man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of the siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a long and arduous struggle for liberty? They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be in the next week? Or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength through irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs, hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemy hath bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak while we make proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people, armed and in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that we possess, are invincible by any force our enemy can send against us. Besides, sirs, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sirs, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. Should we be base enough to desire it, it is already too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard upon the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sirs, let it come. Oh, gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north shall bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death.
Let me be buried on this spot.
In 1810, Edward Carrington was buried in the place where he stood and spoke those words. Less than a month after Henry's speech came the shots heard round the world at Lexington and Concord, where a volunteer force of Minutemen routed a vastly superior force of British regulars. The next night in Williamsburg, redcoats sent by the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, raided the powder magazine and seized 15 barrels of gunpowder. To reclaim it, a company of improvised militia led by Patrick Henry moved toward Williamsburg. During the march, what started out as the Hanover Volunteers grew into an overwhelming force from many counties in support of Henry's action. Rather than shed blood, he negotiated a payment for the missing stores, and the militia was dispersed without incident. The humiliated Dunmore issued a hue and cry against Henry, yet groups of volunteers appeared from one county after another to escort him along his route to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. The Philadelphia Congress wanted each colony to consider the question of independence separately. When the Virginia Convention was elected, Henry was chosen, and, in the words of Edmund Randolph, Mr. Henry became a pillar of fire, leading others through darkness to the promised land. The inflamed convention followed him.
And that it is the mutual duty of all to practice
On May
Christian
15,
forbearance,
1776,
love, and
a
charity
resolution
toward
of
one
independence was passed, and the delegates began work on a plan for self-government. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason, although Henry had a role in drafting the article on religious freedom, passed unanimously on June 12th. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia, and the 13 colonies became the United States of America. Two days later, on July 6th, Patrick Henry became governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, even though he had to be sworn in on his sickbed at Williamsburg, having contracted malaria during the exertions of that remarkable spring. He regained his strength over the summer, and in September took up residence in the governor's palace, in many respects a new man. He changed his famous plain clothing to a suit of velvet, and established an organized administrative process for dealing with what became a relentless procession of crises. On September 15th, 24,000 trained British troops landed in New York. Hopelessly outnumbered, Washington's motley army repeatedly fell back before the advancing British. Ignoring his critics and sometimes his health, Governor Henry concentrated every effort on recruiting men and supplies for the Continental Army. If deliveries arrived sporadically, the spirit of the support was steady, and the Americans began to show their mettle. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led a force of ill-clad and shivering men across the Delaware River. Operating with more courage than resources, they surprised and routed the British forces at Trenton, and were victorious again a week later at Princeton. It was now clear that the British had a fight on their hands. Henry's performance as war governor was so effective and unselfish that he was re-elected without opposition in May. A lull took place as British General Burgoyne slowly moved his large force southward from Canada. Patrick took advantage of the time to focus his attention on a young woman, Dorothea Dandridge. The daughter of one of Henry's neighbors and law clients, Dorothea was a cousin of General Washington's wife, Martha Dandridge Custis. They managed a courtship in spite of the buffets of that fall. It was on their brief honeymoon that news arrived of Washington's defeat at Brandywine. Philadelphia was in British hands. But a few weeks later came news of a great victory in New York. Burgoyne had been defeated at Saratoga. 5,000 British officers and men had surrendered. New threats appeared on the Western Front. The British began to supply Indians in Kentucky with liquor and guns, organizing them for attacks on the colony's outposts. Recognizing the danger, Henry, with some delicacy, managed to outfit an expedition with secret orders to attempt to secure the whole frontier.
Authorized by the Assembly for the expedition
The leader of this campaign was a resourceful young woodsman named George Rogers Clark.
Good luck and Godspeed.
That winter, George Washington wrote from Valley Forge.
We can scarcely count on any supplies, and the goods on hand are so nearly consumed that I look with great concern on the sufferings of the soldiers for the remainder of this year. And as for the next, I view them as naked, unless clothing is collected.
The supply system for the Continental Army was being strangled by the state's unwillingness to support the war and corruption among the suppliers. Certain that the future of the country was at stake, Henry obtained cash and personally supervised the procurement of food and clothing from Virginia's countryside for delivery to Valley Forge. The emergency provisions meant survival, as the Army grimly endured until the supply system began to function. Henry was re-elected to a third term in the face of a worsening situation and his own recurring bouts with malaria. 3,500 British troops arrived in Georgia and soon captured Savannah, driving the thin Continental forces into the Carolinas. To reinforce the South, Henry tried every measure to raise men and supplies from a Virginia already desperately depleted. Meanwhile, the Western Gambit had succeeded. News finally arrived in November that Clark's force had taken the fort at Kaskaskia on July 4th without loss of a single man. The frontiersman was given discretionary powers and, in spite of great hardship, managed one victory after another. In December, the Assembly was able to grandly claim Illinois as a Virginia county. Then came news that General Clinton had left New York with a force of 8,000 to attack Charleston, and in May the British fleet appeared at Portsmouth, Virginia. An effort was made to re-elect Henry, even though he had served the legal maximum of 3 consecutive terms. In truth, he desperately needed rest to restore his shattered health. Jefferson succeeded him, and for safety, the state capital was moved upriver to Richmond. Henry purchased a remote tract of land in Southside, Virginia, and moved there with his still growing family. In seclusion and with the family's constant support, he was gradually able to recover. By May 1780, he was back in the Assembly and the most important member in the House. The effort was continued to reinforce the South, but in June, news came of the fall of Charleston. 6 months later, the traitor Benedict Arnold, now commanding British redcoats, raided Richmond. Faced with an invading army, the legislature had removed itself to the mountains of Charlottesville, near Jefferson's home, Monticello. Seeing an opportunity to capture governor and house in one stroke, Cornwallis dispatched Colonel Bannister Tarleton's elite cavalry dragoons on a surprise raid. The careers of the Virginia delegates might well have ended on that day, but for Captain Jack Jewett, who chanced to observe the troops as they passed the Cuckoo Tavern in Louisa. Possessed of a fleeter horse and knowledge of a shorter route, Jack Jewett went for the ride of his life, arriving just in time to give the legislators warning.
Gentlemen, British dragoons approach. You must flee for your lives.
Patrick Henry left with Speaker Benjamin Harrison, William Christian, and John Tyler, from whose letters comes a description of their appeal for shelter that afternoon.
Good madam, we are members of the Virginia legislature who have been compelled to flee at the sudden approach of enemy dragoons. We would be greatly obliged if you could provide us with any refreshment.
Right on, then, you cowardly knaves. Here have my husband and sons just gone off to Charlottesville to fight for you, and you running away with all your might. Clear out now, you'll get nothing here.
But we were obliged to fly. This is Mr. Speaker Harrison. Surely you don't think he would have fled had it not been necessary.
Well, I'd always thought a great deal of Mr. Harrison, till now. But he'd no business to run from the enemy.
What would you say, my good woman, if I told you that Patrick Henry fled with the rest of us?
I should tell you there wasn't a word of truth in it. Patrick Henry would never do such a cowardly thing.
But this is Patrick Henry.
Well, then, if that's Patrick Henry, it must be all right. Come in, then. You shall have the best in the house.
Madam, our thanks.
Kitty?
As British troops moved through the countryside, the tide began to turn. In the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, south of Henry's estate, the British force under Cornwallis was so badly decimated, they were obliged to withdraw to the east. The decisive battles of Kings Mountain and Cowpens had produced similar retreats, and that fall found Cornwallis and his forces collected at Yorktown. Help from America's French allies cut off his retreat by sea. The troops at Yorktown held until General Washington arrived with the Continental Army. On October 19, 1781, in a formal ceremony, Cornwallis surrendered the British command. The Revolutionary War was over. After years of bitter fighting and sacrifice, the United States of America had won its independence. In less than a century, this young nation would grow to span the continent from sea to shining sea. In 1784 and 85, Henry was elected to 4th and 5th terms as governor. He was easily the most influential political figure in Virginia, and with his experience in the ways and means of government came a deep distrust of centralized power, a persuasion that was to bring him center stage in another momentous crisis. Increasing conflict between the states during the post-war years showed that the legal framework under which all the states were initially united, the Articles of Confederation, would not hold the growing nation together. A reorganization was called for, and delegates for this purpose were duly elected from all the states but Rhode Island in 1787. Patrick Henry refused his appointment, citing financial distress. The delegates convened that summer in Philadelphia. A strong central or federal system for government was proposed, debated by the convention, and defined in a document under the leadership of James Madison, who was to become known as the father of the Constitution. The work of the convention had to be submitted to each state for ratification. 8 states had ratified, and only one more was needed by the time Virginia, the largest and most influential, convened for its debate in June 1788. Mason, a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention had refused to sign the draft because a Bill of Rights had been omitted. He agreed with Henry that the Virginia Convention ought to amend the plan before approving it, and chaired the caucus of the Anti-Federalists, as they were called.
I fear it is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It will seek and find an opportunity to destroy the very principles our government was founded to protect.
We must devise some strategy to unmask this danger and rally our friends.
The Piedmont counties are with us. The young Monroe is coming along. He's slow, but sure.
The western counties are crucial.
As Madison says, we are scuffling for Kentucky votes.
Gentlemen, I fear that the issue is still very much in doubt in spite of our best efforts.
Would now be a good time to speak with our friends from Illinois.
Gentlemen. Even though they met in the largest assembly hall in Richmond, the ratification convention was jammed by a crowd of visitors from all over the state. For 23 days, the issues on both sides were aired. The argument was epitomized in the running debate between Madison and Henry that held the learned delegates spellbound.
Amongst other deformities, it has an awful squinting. It squints towards monarchy. This president may become a king. He is to be supported in extravagant magnificence by 2 sets of tax collectors. He will have a standing army at his command, and a long and rapacious train of officers and dependents. The Congress may regulate elections to their own advantage, increase their own pay without limitation, and they are given powers by the sweeping clause that permits them to pass any law which they deem necessary and proper. But where is your Bill of Rights? There is none.
Gentlemen, the inclusion of a Bill of Rights is both unnecessary and dangerous. It is unnecessary because it is obvious that the general government will have no powers but those which are delegated to it, and will stand as no abridgment to the present statutory and constitutional provisions in the several states, which already allow for such bills of rights. It is dangerous because an enumeration of our rights, gentlemen, if incomplete, must be deemed unsafe, and will have the further provision of implying that those rights not enumerated will be thus given over to the general government.
The idea of ratifying first and amending afterwards strikes me as lunatic. Is the rage for novelty so great that we are first to sign and seal and then to retract? To go into a dungeon? And for what? To get out? Is there not the danger that once you are in, the bolts of federal authority shall shut you in?
Is whether this be a federal government or a consolidated government. It is really of a mixed nature. It is in a manner unprecedented, for we cannot find one express example in the experience of the world. It stands by itself. In some respects, it is a government of a federal nature, and in other respects, a government of a consolidated nature. But who are the parties to it? The people, but not the people as composing one great body, but the people as composing 13 sovereign states. But, sir, these states are not bound by it as it is without their own consent. Should the 13 states adopt it,
our rights to a consolidated, energetic government with the purse in one hand and the sword in the other?
Under this new Constitution,
you should not.
The purse is in the hands of the representatives of the people. And I believe it will be found in practice that those who fix the public burdens who feel a far greater degree of responsibility when they are to impose them on the citizens directly than if they are to say what sums should be paid by the states, as under the present Articles of Confederation.
Perhaps an invincible attachment to the dearest rights of man may, in this refined and enlightened age, be deemed old-fashioned. If such is the case, I am contented to be so. We draw our spirit of liberty from our British ancestors, and by that spirit have triumphed over every difficulty. But now, that American spirit, coupled with the ropes and chains of consolidation, is converting this country
as a storm arose outside,
to a
and
powerful,
Henry was illuminated by
mighty
bolts of
empire.
lightning.
If you force the citizens of this country to become the subjects of a great consolidated empire of America, your government will not have sufficient energy to keep them together. There will be no checks, no real balances in this government. Liberty, the most precious blessing of mankind, give us that jewel, and you may take everything else.
When the count was called, Virginia ratified the Constitution of the United States by the slender margin of 10 votes. At the same time, the opponents secured promises that an attached Bill of Rights would be incorporated by later amendments. The rights listed by the convention were drawn from Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776. Many of the other states made similar recommendations. When adopted as the Bill of Rights, the fundamental liberties which Patrick Henry had championed for a lifetime, even to the extreme of arguing against a constitution that did not guarantee them, became a part of the government of the United States as the first 10 amendments. Patrick Henry was truly without parallel in a courtroom, and his exploits both in a tragic and a comic line were legendary. One of the authenticated stories is told by biographer William Wirt as it came from Judge Archibald Stewart of New London Courthouse. A local Tory storekeeper, John Hook, sued John Venable, a commissary of the Continental Army, to recover 2 steers seized by Venable during the Cornwallis invasion. Henry spoke in Venable's defense.
Consider the American Army, exposed almost naked to the rigor of the winter sky, marking the frozen ground on which it trod with the blood of its unshod feet. Where is the man with an American heart in his bosom who would not have opened his fields, his barns, the doors of his house, the portals of his heart, to welcome with open arms even the meanest soldier in this little band of frozen patriots? Where is the man? There he sits. But as to whether the heart of an American beats in his bosom, you, gentlemen, are to judge. When the British, humiliated and defeated, marched out of their trenches at Yorktown, they saw the light of victory which shone in every patriot face, and heard the resounding cry of triumph as it reverberated through the ranks and echoed from the neighboring hills and river. And yet, what note of discord is this that mars the general joy and silences the acclamations of victory? They are the notes of John Hook, hoarsely bawling through the American camp, "Beef! Beef! Beef! Beef!
Case dismissed.
Biographer George Morgan relates another story of a young couple who wanted to get married, but the girl was not of age. The young
really
fellow
love
took
her,
his
do
trouble to Patrick Henry.
Do you love her better than gold? How much gold would you give out of your pocket if you could have your sweetheart and never cast a shadow on the doorway of a jail?
Well, I'd give 100 guineas.
Agreed. Then listen carefully and do exactly as I tell you. Have your sweetheart take a good horse from her father's stable, mount and ride to meet you at a prearranged place. You will be on foot. Get up behind her, ride to the nearest preacher, and get married. You will be arrested, but never fear, for I shall be there to see you through.
In court, Patrick called the young woman to take the stand
Young
and...
lady, can you give us an account of your elopement?
I told my lover to meet me at a certain spot. I got a good horse from my father's stable, and I went to where he was. I took my lover up behind me, and I ran away with him.
So he ran away with you?
Oh, no, sir. I ran away with him.
As the story is told, the court got into a side-splitting shake. The crowd roared. The Commonwealth attorney came down the persimmon tree, and the happy chap marched off with the persimmon. If championing the Bill of Rights was Henry's great contribution as a legislator, his argument in the British debts case was the supreme achievement in his law practice. An associate counsel wrote to him, "Next fall, the great question will come on as to the British merchants' right to recover from our citizens. Your countrymen look up to you on that occasion." Before the trial in Richmond, Henry secluded himself for several days in his law office and filled a notebook over an inch thick with headings for his argument. His grasp of the legal precedents astonished his peers. As to his oratory, an eyewitness said, if he was ever seen to give his spectacles a cant to the top of his wig, it was a declaration of war, and his adversaries must stand clear.
Gentlemen, it is my contention that in revolutionary wars, debts become subject to forfeiture. But had we been subdued, would not every right have been wrested from us? What right would have been preserved? Would it not be absurd to save debts while they should burn, hang, and destroy?
The famous portrait by Thomas Sully was based on this occasion. The court's decision invalidated remaining balances on war debts. Although the Supreme Court was later to reverse this decision, in the end, much of the debt either remained unrecovered or was paid by the federal government. In 1794, Henry moved to what he referred to as one of the garden spots of the world, a plantation on the fertile lowlands of the Stanton River called Red Hill. Here was ample room for those of his 17 children still at home and for numerous grandchildren. Here was time to sit under the great tree with a jug of spring water, playing the fiddle or reading the Bible. He was offered many honors in the following years, including appointment as Chief Justice of the United States, but he refused them all on grounds of declining health. Finally, in 1799, George Washington, in a confidential letter, succeeded in eliciting Henry's help in what he termed an emergency. Virginia's Jeffersonian Republicans were in full-scale opposition to the Federalists' Alien and Sedition Acts. Indeed, Virginians like Madison were sounding in '98 much like Henry had sounded in '88. Even though he'd been out of political life for almost 10 years and was desperately ill, Henry declared himself a candidate for the House of Delegates and announced that he would speak at Charlotte Courthouse.
Recent events have planted thorns upon my pillow. I cannot sleep while Virginia is rebel to the government of these United States. If I am asked what is to be done, When a people feel themselves to be intolerably oppressed, my answer is ready. Overturn the government. But matters must not be carried to this length if there is any other recourse. For if you ever recur to another change, you may bid adieu forever to representative government. You cannot exchange the present government but for a monarchy. If the administration have done wrong, let us all go wrong together. Let us not split into factions which must destroy that union on which our existence hangs. United, we stand. Divided, we fall.
Although he was elected easily, Henry was not able to return to the legislature. His condition, an intestinal blockage, continued to worsen. According to the account that has been preserved by the family, on June 6, 1799, Patrick's physician, Dr. Cabell, after trying every remedy, offered him a dose of liquid mercury, saying that,
"This may prove fatal, but without it you can only live a short while, and it may relieve you."
Dear Lord, take my soul, save my family, my country, and my friends. Amen.
Dr. Cabell, who greatly loved him, went out upon the lawn, and in his grief threw himself down upon the earth under one of the trees. Soon, when he had sufficiently mastered himself, the doctor came back to his patient.
Friend, we have had many arguments respecting the Christian religion. Observe now how great a benefit and reality religion is to a man about to die.
He continued to breathe very softly for some moments, after which they who were looking upon him saw that his life had departed. The executors found a sealed envelope with Henry's will. Inside was his draft of the Stamp Act resolves, with a commentary in his hand on the back. It recounted how he had written them alone, unadvised and unassisted, on a blank leaf of an old law book. He described their passage in the face of every opposition from men of weight and the precipitous effect the resolutions had on the political struggle that was to result in American independence. He concluded with,
"Whether this will prove a blessing or a curse will depend upon the use our people make of the blessings which a gracious God hath bestowed on us. Righteousness alone can exalt them as a nation. Reader, whoever thou art, remember this, and in thy sphere practice virtue thyself and encourage it in others."